It's a nice sunny day outside, so you decide you want to go do some flying. But your landing looks like this. I'm sure that wasn't the landing he was intending for, and I'm sure there's a few people that would testify that my landings felt that hard. But there was something that happened right before this situation that created this situation. Watch this. You've heard me talk about dirty air or wake turbulence in some of my air traffic control versus pilot videos or some other viral debriefs. And I can't be 100% sure that's what happened. This pilot could have been reaching for their GoPro, but my suspicion is that it was actually wake turbulence that caused that. But there is a big difference when you're dealing with wake turbulence from my plane compared to when you're dealing with a helicopter like this that's coming in to land at an airport. In a second, I'm going to explain to you why it's different when you're dealing with the two different types of aircraft when you're coming in to land behind them. But look at this plane here as it comes through the clouds. You see these spinning clouds that are coming off of each wing? Those spinning things are called wingtip vortices, and they're out there whether it's a clear day and you don't see them, which is typically the case. But those are happening anytime that wing is generating lift. And that's why a lot of aircraft will have these wingtips installed at the ends of the wings. Sometimes people ask me if the airlines put those wingtips on there because they look cool, and no, they're extremely expensive pieces that they put on the wings, and that's because those wingtip vortices on some wing designs, that vortice will come back over and on top of the wing, making the wing less efficient. If the wing's less efficient, then it's going to spend more gas, and gas is a very expensive part of what's going on when planes are flying. So now that you know what wingtip vortices look like, let's say I come in and land my beautiful 747 and I land it perfectly right here at the 1,000-foot markers, which of course I always do. Those same wingtip vortices will be generated from both my wings, just like you saw in that video, creating dirty air. And on a calm day, they will move down into the outside of my plane. If you watch this video again, you'll see as these vortices are actually pushing outward. But those vortices are only going to be generated while my aircraft is generating lift, which is extremely important to remember. So if you're flying your bug smasher around and you come in to land behind a 747, and keep in mind a controller is never going to have you land directly behind a 747. They're going to give you several minutes to let those wingtip vortices or wake turbulence go away. And because of course I landed perfectly right here on the 1,000-foot markers, you're going to want to land down here, so you don't get into my dirty air. By landing further down the runway, you're actually staying away from the dirty air that's created from my wings generating lift. Even though I may take 8,000 or 9,000 feet from my plane to roll out and actually stop, as long as you land beyond where I stopped having my wings generate lift, you're going to be fine. You're not going to have that wake turbulence. Now, back in the day when I was flying the CRJ 900, just like in this photo, I was actually flying right behind a 737 and we were in cruise and we caught wake, which is very abnormal, but we caught the wake of this jet for some reason, and it actually pushed our wing down a lot. And it surprised me so much that both of the pilots, we grabbed the controls and we were thinking like, what's going on? And I actually radioed to air traffic control to find out what kind of plane it was, because I've never been that far in trail of another aircraft and have it actually generate enough wake turbulence to push the wing down like that. So I've had that, but obviously we were at, I don't know, 36,000 feet. It's not a big deal, but when you're 10 or 15 feet above the ground, it's definitely more of a concern. Now here's a mistake that a lot of people make. There's two parallel runways and they see this 747 come in and land. And I know what you're thinking. Well, that's fine. You're on a different runway. I'm landing on this runway. I don't have to worry about it. But this wingtip vortice is going to create wake turbulence from the right wing, and that's going to slide directly into the area where you're landing. So the wind direction and the proximity to where the runways are all things that you have to keep in mind, because you could be coming in and looking at that plane landing on that other runway and thinking, ha, I got it figured out. I'm a genius. I landed on this other runway. I'm nowhere near the wake turbulence. And then you have this happen. So the major difference you're going to see from any fixed-wing aircraft, 747 or whatever that comes in and lands, and a rotary wing, a helicopter, is that when we land, our wings stop generating lift as we taxi and move around the airport. But obviously, helicopters most of the time don't have wheels underneath them, so they're taxiing while they're moving around. They're actually just hovering. And if they're hovering, their wing, their their blade that's up there is acting as a wing, is generating lift. Because it's generating lift, it's generating that same wake tip vortice that you saw earlier. So even though you can't see it from this helicopter as it's flying, it's generating one of these massive wingtip vortices, which will have the exact same impact. So as you're coming into land on your small plane, you're thinking, okay, well, there's a helicopter way down there and he's off to the side of the runway. It doesn't really matter, but the direction of the wind and the fact that it's a large helicopter, it's a Huey, those things are going to really impact what's going to happen to you when you come into land, because that is going to be spinning and you can't see it. So it's an extremely dangerous risk that you can't see. So you have a nice calm day, you're coming into land, and then something like that happens. Now I'm sure if this pilot saw my plane come into land, he would be thinking, okay, I really have to be prepared about what I can do about this situation. But with the scenario, I think it's a very common mistake a lot of people would make, and luckily it doesn't happen more often. Now, could he have done something to remedy the situation once that wake turbulence got onto his wing? It's going to be really hard. That low to the ground with that small of a plane, it's a very light plane. And when you're talking about the vortices that's being created from that relatively heavy helicopter, it's going to be really hard that low to the ground. Now, higher up in the air, maybe he could spin it all the way around and do a barrel roll, but he's only a few feet off the ground. He could maybe put the rudder in or do something to try to save it, but at that point, you know, people would say, oh, I would do this, but the reality is that happens extremely fast. I've mentioned before in some of my videos how long it takes for these bigger jets to have our engines spool up, and this is a perfect example because you can hear it. So right about here, he hits the go round button, but watch as he keeps coming down toward the ground before the engines spool up enough for them to fly out of it. Now I'm going to rewind it so you can listen to when the engines start spooling up and you can watch it keep coming down. Something that's surprising to a lot of people is that on a smaller aircraft, when you do a go-around, you add the power and that thing reacts right away, like a fighter jet. But a 747, it takes a while. It's heavy, the engines are really big, and it takes a while for those things to spool up, those engines to all spool up to start generating lift. So the fact that it's continuing to descend is normal. That's something that we expect. And that's why, as a 747 pilot, it's very important to be thinking ahead of your aircraft. And that's on any large aircraft. As your aircraft gets bigger, you need to be thinking more and more ahead. But doing a go-round like this is actually a lot easier than on a lot of other aircraft. On a small plane, when you do a go-around, especially if you're by yourself, it's a lot going on. But on a 747, you really just have to hit one button. This right here is where we hold our hand on the 747. And you see these two buttons here? That's right in front of your ring finger and your middle finger. So all you have to do on a 747 when you're doing a go-around is your hand's there. Your hand is always there during landing, and that's why I think it'd be good for you, if you're ever going to go to flight school, is to get used to keeping your hand always on your throttle. I've seen sometimes pilots, and I think I probably was guilty of this too in flight school, wanting to have both hands on the controls when I was flying. But the problem is that if you have to do a go-around, now you're trying to move fast and find where that throttle is, even if you have the muscle memory. So you'll never see a commercial airline pilot fly where they have their hand off of the throttle. So all you got to do is reach up, hit that button once, and then you say, go around flaps 20. So when you say go around flaps 20, you're hitting that button so the other pilot knows you're doing a go around, and then they're going to change your flap settings. The flaps I'm referring to are these things that come off the back of the wing. They allow for us to come in and land and take off at a much slower speed. Those flaps aren't really necessary per se. If you wanted to have a runway that was like 10 miles long, you could get fast enough where you didn't need those. But instead of doing that, instead of going extremely fast, they designed these flaps to be able to come out so the plane could generate lift and take off at a slower speed and also land at a slower speed. Like sometimes I'll land at, let's say, 160 knots. That's relatively fast in the world of aviation. Sometimes it's 170. But if you had no flaps on there, maybe I'm landing at like 250 knots or 260 knots. It's a lot faster, a lot more can go wrong because you're going a lot faster. So when you say go around flaps 20, you're telling the other pilot to move these to 20 degrees. Once that other pilot puts the flaps to 20 degrees, what he's going to do is start looking at the instruments of the aircraft to verify that the plane is climbing away from the ground. And he's going to say positive rate, and then the pilot who's flying is going to verify that and say gear up. The reason that we verify that we have a positive rate of climb away from the ground is, notice this tire here touches the ground. Another second or two later in the go around and the plane could have actually hit the ground if the gear was up. I'm not sure what caused the go around. It could have been wind shear, it could have been a million different things, and it doesn't really matter. But you always want to verify the plane is going away from the ground before the gear will come up. And that problem is that sometimes pilots get overloaded and they start doing things like telling air traffic control they're doing a go around. I'm guilty of it, because you feel like, hey, this is abnormal, it's not what we're supposed to be doing, or it's not what we were planning to do, so I need to let them know right away. But the most important thing that I always talk about, that every pilot knows, first thing you want to do, aviate. First thing. The last thing you need to do is tell air traffic control. They know, and they see this huge chunk of metal going away from the ground, they know that you're going around. But as you'll notice here, the gear is not going up. So I'm going to show you roughly what it should sound like during this go around. Go around flaps 20. The flap should go up. The other pilot right here should say positive rate, and the pilot flying should say gear up. But as you can see, the gear doesn't come up. Now, I'm sure they eventually got the gear up. I'm guilty of this too. I've had it happen in the simulator, usually because there's like, I don't know, something else, like the wing's on fire, or something else is going on, and then we're just distracted and they overload you. And they do that on purpose in the simulator, so in real life you don't forget things like this. And I'm sure it was probably a second or two later that they got to it, because what happens is you get overloaded. You're planning on landing and now everything switches. So you have to switch from I'm landing mode and all the things that you need to do there to, hey, we're going back up in the air and takeoff mode. And even though it's something that we train for, it's not something that we do very often in real life. And that's why they want to make it easy by just hitting the button and letting the plane go back up in the air again. So just remember, if your plane's doing this, it's nothing to worry about. If you enjoyed this video, check out one of these two over here. I look forward to hearing from you. Until then, keep the blue side up.